Hi, I'm Natalie Brunell, and thank you so much for checking out the Coin Stories podcast video page. This is a special episode where I'm trying to get a better understanding of the crisis that's playing out in Ukraine. I wanted to sift through some of the misinformation with someone in the space that is well respected and better understand how some of the headlines actually relate to Bitcoin. Now, this podcast does not provide financial advice and does not reflect the views of any of the sponsors. This episode is powered in part by the Bitcoin Conference 2022. It's going to be held in Miami this year, April 6th through 9th, and it's going to be the biggest Bitcoin event in the world. All 4 days will be jam-packed with exclusive content, exciting announcements, and an incredible lineup of Bitcoin speakers, artists, and leaders. Day 1 is Industry Day for enterprising Bitcoiners who are looking to build a business or career within the ecosystem. Days 2 and 3 are General Conference Days featuring speakers like El Salvador President Nayib Bukele, who has promised a big surprise at the event, as well as CEOs like Michael Saylor, Elizabeth Stark, Jack Mallers, Adam Back, and hundreds more. The conference caps off on the 4th day with the world's first and largest Bitcoin music festival, Sound Money Fest, headlined by rapper and fellow Bitcoiner Logic. You're also going to hear from Steve Aoki, CL, Run the Jewels, deadmau5, and many more. Last year's conference sold out, and this year's is on pace to be 3 times larger, so make sure you grab your tickets before it's too late. You can head to b.tc/conference and use the code COINSTORIES for 10% off your pass. This episode is also sponsored in part by OKCoin, my favorite place to dollar cost average into Bitcoin without the crazy fees. OKCoin is the fastest growing exchange serving over 190 countries globally with the easiest onboarding and lowest fees around. They're on a mission to make learning about and buying Bitcoin easier than ever, and they're all about bringing more financial literacy to everyone, which is something I really care about as well. From being the only exchange to integrate Lightning to contributing over $1 million to Bitcoin core devs, they are doing incredible work to further the Bitcoin ecosystem. You can head to go.okcoin.com/Natalie for $10 in Bitcoin when you sign up. This portion of today's episode is also brought to you by SoFi. With SoFi's all-in-one app, you can save, spend, earn, borrow, and invest. You can buy stocks and ETFs, open an automated portfolio, or my favorite part, start accumulating Bitcoin, all with no account minimums and zero commissions on trades. Whether you're new to the world of Bitcoin or you've been dollar cost averaging or trading like a pro for years, SoFi has something for everyone. You can head to SoFi.com/Natalie and sign up for an active invest account to win up to $1,000. All right, I want to get right into this because there are so many questions surrounding what's actually happening in Ukraine and Russia. And there's so much information and misinformation to kind of sift through online, especially in the age of citizen journalism and social media. It seems like both sides want to hijack the message here in the US, the right and the left, but we have to remember that there are people's lives at stake. And I wanted to sift through some of the headlines and really better understand the crisis that's unfolding. And I wanted to talk to someone that the Bitcoin community trusts. So I actually put out a tweet this weekend. You might have seen it, asking for knowledgeable sources on Ukraine, where I could just have a neutral person to ask questions because I'm certainly not an expert in this space. And many of you pointed me to someone by the name of Jeet Sidhu, including someone I really respect and admire, Preston Pysh. So thank you so much. I had a chance to reach out to him, go through all of his threads. He's always citing his sources and seems to know a lot about the situation and the conflict that's unfolding there in real time. So I asked a lot of questions that hopefully you might have had as well, and also wanted to understand how this relates to Bitcoin and the adoption of something that is censorship resistant and that can't be confiscated by any government, and how that's playing out as well in real time. So without further ado, here's Jeet. All right. Well, Jeet, thank you so much for joining me. And I really appreciate all of the tweets that you're putting out because Bitcoiners in the space, some really prominent ones, are really taking notice. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here.
Okay, so first of all, let's sort of lay the land and offer people a chance to get to know you better. Can you tell me just a little bit about your background? I know you're a director at a financial company, you're in the fintech space, but you've obviously taken an interest in this whole Ukraine situation. So what should people know about your background?
Yeah, so I'm just a finance guy who's interested in Bitcoin. In the past, I worked in corporate finance. I worked in private equity debt for a couple of years, and now I work in fintech. Disclaimer, nothing I say is financial advice or represents my employer. I'm just kind of a concerned citizen. Most people know me because of my Twitter account where I talk about current events in Bitcoin. And I also have a TikTok called The Bitcoin Files, where I have 68,000 followers and talk about financial history. So I kind of have a habit of collecting interesting facts and maps and photos and things and putting them together in a way to help people understand better what's going on. Recently, I was trying to keep up with what's going on in Ukraine, and I started putting together everything in a thread, just like I do for Bitcoin topics, and keeping that don't trust, verify spirit. And it ended up getting a lot of traction. So I actually ended up getting some DMs from ex-military officers, journalists, and some folks in the Bitcoin space as well, who encouraged me to continue, and they found it was helpful to keep up with current events. I knew about Ukraine at a very surface level. I've read a couple of books on Ukraine, and I read the paper. So I saw it in 2014 when it first came up in the news, but I'm still getting my pronunciations wrong, and I'm kind of learning live in public on my Twitter timeline.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned in the intro, Preston Pysh, who I really respect and admire in the space, he right away mentioned you as someone who's very knowledgeable about the Ukraine situation on Twitter. So, just to put it out there for the folks that are watching this and are my audience members who are big Bitcoiners, but maybe unfamiliar with Ukraine, why should they trust you on this topic?
So, don't trust anyone, verify what they say. I think the reason you should, take a serious look at the stuff that I'm posting, or just, in general, how do you evaluate who you trust is, are they posting their sources? So for a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, I'm simply posting my sources. If I get something wrong, I generally correct it pretty quickly. One of the things that I've noticed is oftentimes people will just post a headline with breaking in all caps. And I'm guilty of that too, but I always include a source whenever possible. So don't trust anything I say, please verify it yourself.
Awesome. I love that. In the spirit of journalism, I think that's very, very important. So can you tell me a little bit just about how you're sourcing your information? Because one thing that I'm seeing out there, and, I guess this is to be expected in our social media landscape right now and citizen journalism spreading, is that there's a lot of misinformation. There are pictures being shared that were actually originally published in 2021. There are headlines that are misleading. The Russian media is obviously portraying this whole situation in one way, and the US media portraying it another way. So how are you vetting your sources and where are you getting your information?
Yeah, I think it's really a question about media literacy. And so I think every citizen in America should understand how to evaluate sources. And so one of the things, just to give you maybe just walk through some examples, one of the things that you can do is, there are reverse image sites on the internet. So if you see something that's particularly sensational, do a reverse image search. Oftentimes, any details that someone mentions, you can look back in the news to see when it first appeared on Google. So, for example, one of the local municipal authorities in Ukraine said, you should throw Molotov cocktails at Russian armored personnel carriers. And then immediately a video pops up that shows people doing just that. And, sometimes you just got to trust your spidey sense and just double check things. So, people responding to a tweet within 30 minutes live somewhere in Ukraine just doesn't make any sense. And of course, it turns out that video was from 2014. So a lot of what I'm doing is there's a ton of information coming at me on Twitter and group chats that I'm in, and just talking to people. And generally what I try to do is, if they're a reliable source, I give them a little bit of extra certainty level. And if they're an unreliable source, I try to caveat that in the tweet. And there's some stuff that I just simply don't post, because some stuff you can tell right away. It sounds like, an Avengers movie event, and you just got to be careful about some of those types of things. And I think that gets you pretty far.
Yeah. So let's give us some background on this, because it seems like this kind of exploded or erupted out of nowhere. But I mean, even just today in one of your threads, you were posting a video from a couple weeks back of President Putin speaking at a conference, mentioning and almost warning that something like this could happen. So can you tell us how this all unfolded and why the situation led to Russia invading Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it's like one of the things that I try to avoid when I'm traveling is being too much of a tourist, right? And so and similarly, whenever I'm looking at current events, I try to avoid whatever the sensational thing that's going on right now and look back into, picking up a history book or something. So, one of the things to understand is that Ukraine and Russia have some ties in deep history going back more than 1,000 years. When the first Vikings were setting up Kievan Rus, both Russia and Ukraine claimed their descent from this event 1,000 years ago. They're both involved in Orthodox Christianity. There's Russian speakers in both countries. More recently, they were in the Soviet Union. And so one of the things that I try to do is understand, who are the key players and sort of how do they define their own histories? So Ukrainian nationalists and Russian nationalists have totally different ideas of what the past was. I'm going to run through some of the key events so that when you hear things pop up, you'll be able to check back to the references. So, they were both in the Soviet Union. Something like 10 million Ukrainians died in the Holodomor. It was a starvation by the communists of small landholders. There was an attempted Russification of the country. And it's just kind of too much to cover, but maybe the kickoff point is in the breakup of the Soviet Union, significant populations of Russians remained outside the borders of Russia. And, Ukraine ended up having a lot of Russian speakers. And then also Ukraine ended up giving up their nuclear weapons. So that's kind of a critical event on the Ukrainian side. In Russia, the 1990s were absolutely brutal. I don't think they teach this in our college textbooks, but they basically followed all the advice of the American economic advisors, liberalized the country, but it resulted in things like oligarchs, organized crime owning most of the country. So when you think about Russia today, some of those things you think about had their roots in the 90s. Putin's kind of a guy who got a lot of that under control. He did it in a couple different very shady ways, which I'm sure we can get into later. But and then the other player is NATO. So North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The goal was, okay, how do we compete with the Soviet Union? How do we help these countries? After the 1990s, there's basically no reason for it to exist. And if it would have just stayed in autopilot, they would have been able to kind of contain Russia. But they ended up doing some things that were very haphazard that triggered Russia to kind of arm up and acting a little bit aggressive. And at the same time, America had the war on terror. So we were like totally distracted for, call it 20 years. And in the meantime, Russia had free reign, and they ended up completely like reforming their military. They annexed a couple of territories, and most American journalists, commentators are completely caught off guard. I think because they're not paying attention. Similar story with China. I think that there's a lot of American journalists who don't speak Russian and don't speak Chinese, and they don't take some of the things that some of their leaders may say at face value. And as a result, they don't really understand the motivations of some of our, geopolitical antagonists.
Well, that's a good place to ask you this question then. Why would Putin want Ukraine? Why is this becoming an issue once again, when clearly the country has been independent, but sort of they've been expected to follow certain rules, right? They can't join NATO, they can't obtain nuclear weapons. And what I understand is that the Russian media has been reporting that essentially is what started this, that it wasn't Russia being the aggressor, that Ukraine threatened to obtain or said that they could obtain nuclear weapons, and they indicated that they wanted to join NATO. Now, obviously, again, the countries are portraying this in very different ways. So can you sift that out for us? Why does Russia now want Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think it's a case of some of the American foreign policy was on autopilot for a long time. So their goal was just expand NATO. Every little country, they let them join. Basically in 2014, there was like a Russian-backed president. Some would say that American-backed NGOs then tried to help overthrow him. The Russians reacted by sponsoring their own, separatists in the country. They ended up, carving out a piece of the country for themselves. But basically, the reason why in the past they wouldn't want Ukraine to join NATO is because Russia does view themselves as a great power. Putin, in particular, if you think about his sense of history, if you listen to some of his YouTube shows where he's talking to normal Russian citizens, like he really does have a sense of history. He talks about it all the time. You have to think, if he talks about it all the time and he acts on it all the time, maybe that's his key motivation. They don't want to get encircled, and they don't want to end up in a situation where they can be surrounded. Like, Moscow is very close to all of these countries in Europe. They don't want to end up in a situation where there's nukes in Europe and they're strategically like cut off in weird ways. In 2019, what's happened more recently is, you had so in 2014. Basically, the Russians took key parts of the country, and the Ukrainian army was, scrambled. Since then, militia units in Ukraine and the Ukrainian army in general has had a lot of support from the West and from Europe, European Union and America, and they've built back up, and they're on this trajectory where they're going to become more powerful. And I think what happened was Putin sees the trajectory of the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian society. He also sees that they've started talking openly about joining NATO, and they've started there's some things which are more rumored by the Russians, which who knows if they're true or not, like building bases, sending in cruise missiles and stuff. And seeing that and realizing in 10 years he can't act, he has to act now. I think he's gone ahead and with his sense of history, basically tried to act to take Ukraine. So it's not. I mean, part of it is the NATO thing and the avoiding the strategic displacement. But another part of it is also like he really views Ukraine as part of Russia because of these longstanding ties. And I think that's another factor why there's some things that may seem irrational, which once you incorporate that, start to make a little bit of sense.
Yeah, obviously decades of history. I can kind of relate to the historical aspect because my family's from Poland, so they know what it means to experience Russian occupation. My mom speaks Russian actually, so they're paying attention to this very, very closely. Can you offer a little bit of perspective and maybe history on President Zelensky? I mean, I thought it was fascinating to learn that he was an actor just a couple of years ago, playing someone who randomly became the president of Ukraine. Some folks out there, critics, call him a puppet president. What's your understanding based on your research?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He was a former comedian / actor turned president. There's a lot of people who are like that. For example, there's some politicians in Italy who are like that. Obviously, Donald Trump in the United States played an executive on TV and then ended up becoming president. I think people like the normal average person sees someone play an important person on TV, they feel like he may become that person. And what's interesting for Zelensky is earlier on, people could have accused him of being like a puppet or things like that, or not like a serious president. But I think he's ended up actually becoming the role. And so to your point, there's definitely some news reports which show photos from last year, but the reality is, as far as we can tell, he was on the ground, or he is on the ground in Kiev. He's talking with the troops. He's getting people excited about defending Ukraine. And some of the messages that he's put out, some of the speeches he's given are very presidential, and they're going to have a positive impact. He's getting other countries interested in helping Ukraine. He's getting politicians interested in helping Ukraine. And he's getting the average person in the street kind of weighing more towards, picking up arms, I guess, and helping in whatever the way they can, rather than staying away from the conflict.
Well, it's been really remarkable to see him basically say, I don't want to be evacuated. I'm going to stay here. What I need is an ammunition, not a ride. But then at the same time, we've also seen images of him depicted in this military gear, but they were old. They weren't from right now. But then we do see him, in videos with other members of his administration out there. So, I mean, is he out there on the front lines? Is that your understanding? And do you think as this plays out, I would imagine his life is in grave, grave danger?
Yeah, I think the way to think about it is, the Ukrainians have their ambitions for their country. The Russians have their ambitions for their country, but there's other groups involved as well, like NATO, America, the various journalists, and their goal is to instrumentalize the Ukrainians for their cause. So, for example, none of this would be an issue, because if the Germans, for example, didn't have this obsession with green energy and they just had nuclear power, they would have less of a need to import all this oil and natural gas from the Russians. And, that's almost like the root cause here. But there are groups, I think, that are trying to instrumentalize the Ukrainians and kind of, send them to grind down the Russian artillery and other things like that. So that's a real situation. The specific piece of fake news you're talking about is a lot of American journalists were actually posting pictures of him from about a year ago where he's wearing all this military equipment in order to fit a narrative. So their narrative that they need in order to push a certain view involves a military president. Now, I don't know how much more military you can get than being in the middle of a city that's being surrounded with like a bulletproof vest and a gun, but he has a target on his back and he is fighting. I think all indications are that he's probably in Kiev, but we can't know. And from a safety perspective, it's probably better if he evacuates. From a public relations and morale perspective, it's probably better if he stays and fights. So we'll see how it plays out. The reality is a lot of Ukrainian prominent people are fighting. So the Klitschko brothers, who are heavyweight boxers, Poroshenko, who's the former president, he has a lawsuit against him, but he came back and he is fighting as well. So I think you just got to be careful because there is a ground reality. He is probably in the city, or he's around the city, or he was in the city and he was fighting. He is putting himself in a dangerous situation. But you need to avoid, I think, some of the overshooting from overzealous journalists who want to push a particular narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what's been really interesting to see. It's almost like everything is politicized in this country, right? I'm sure you're tired of it. I certainly am. This is a war breaking out in Eastern Europe, and somehow the left and the right are trying to hijack the message for their own benefit, which has just been crazy. And it's like, is there anything that unites us anymore? I mean, we'll talk about Bitcoin in a little bit, but it's just crazy to see just some of the fervor on both sides and starting to grab onto different narratives. And so again, I just wanted to weed through that, and I really appreciate your help on that. Obviously, one of the big headlines with this is sanctions. The US wants to do what it can to cripple Russia economically, but it poses some interesting questions because now we live in a digital currency world. We have Bitcoin. Some people think that that Russia would even make the move to go onto the Bitcoin standard or adopt Bitcoin in response to sanctions. I at one point was bullish on that. Now I'm a little bit I'm a little bit bearish on that actually happening, because I think Russia ultimately wants control, and I don't think Bitcoin is the direction that they would head in. But I wanted to get your take. First of all, what are the sanctions? You had a big thread on them, and then and how digital currency or cryptocurrency plays in.
Yeah, so the TLDR, probably the two most important sanctions are the decision to ban some Russian banks from the use of the SWIFT system and targeting the assets of the Russian central bank. So SWIFT is, I'm looking online and people are overcomplicating it. It's basically an international ACH or automated clearinghouse. It's like sending a wire from your bank. So anyone can go on your whatever your bank is, and there's going to be a thing that says payment and then send a wire. People send wires all the time. It's very normal. But SWIFT is for sending wires internationally between companies. And anytime you send a wire internationally, in particular, you need to run a know your customer and anti-money laundering check. And there's a list that the government maintains. And if someone's name is on that list, you don't want to do business with them because then you could lose your own banking access. So people really care about that. When they put a bank on that list, it's like a death sentence for that bank because they're going to face a bank run as people try to get their money out and stuff. And then in particular, the Russian banking system is kind of particularly concentrated. So my understanding is they're planning to target the top 10 banks in Russia, which is a significant portion of the total banks. But also one thing to understand is, I mentioned, I think the real villains here are the Germans because of their green energy obsession and their hatred of nuclear energy, because within these sanctions is a huge carve out for anything related to oil and gas. So they don't want to interrupt the flow of oil and gas to Germany. The other big thing was the Russian central bank thing. The way to understand it is basically anytime there's a financial panic in a developing country, not in the United States, I think, but basically what happens is people get scared that the dollars that they have, they generally don't have stocks like we do in America, and their money's going to be in like real estate or in like cash under their mattress. They want to immediately run and convert it into something that's going to hold value. So that's either US dollars or it's things like jewelry, cars, whatever they can put the money in. And when people panic and start doing that, there's going to be a glut of rubles or whatever the currency is in the market. What central banks do is they step in and they scoop up some of that glut. It's like a supply and demand thing. They don't want people to freak out. They want to even things out. Russia's built up, let's call it $600 billion of foreign currency reserves to deal with situations like this. They've actually used it in the 2008 financial crisis, in 2014 during the prior round of sanctions. So they have a system that works. One of the things that's happened is I think that they've been planning ahead. They've understood that at some point additional sanctions may come into play if they have territorial ambitions, in Ukraine or in other areas. And so what they've done is they've moved a significant portion of their foreign currency reserves into places that can't be taken by the European Union or the Americans. And in particular, a significant portion, call it 20-something% in gold. And one of the things that I found, which was really interesting, was this information is publicly available. So I put out my analysis of the situation. I said, look, it's roughly 50% that cannot be seized. Sure enough, and all the journalists were reporting it as if it was the end of the Russian banking system. But sure enough, a couple hours later, there's a talk, and again, I don't think many people have actually reviewed the talk where they discuss it. I put the transcript up online for other people to review, but basically the guy who's talking says the same thing, the minister or whatever says the same thing that I was looking at, which is, yeah, it looks like they just moved all their assets into places that we can't actually target. So I think the key takeaways there are: one, there's a lot of information available online. Most journalists aren't looking. As a concerned citizen, you could probably look if you wanted to. The other thing is, I think that there's something to be said for the fact that Russia's been preparing for this for a long time. I think that it says something about Putin's ambitions.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I have found that completely fascinating as well. The fact that they have stockpiles of gold, the country has very little debt. I mean, it's night and day compared to what the US financial system looks like right now. I feel like they smell blood in the water. The US has grown increasingly weak, even though we do still have the dollar as the reserve currency. And I think it's allowing if this was a chess game, it's allowing for Russia and China to make certain moves that they maybe couldn't make, a couple decades ago, which could be a little bit scary. But yeah, I found your thread really interesting because you did mention that, in the past, the ruble in the 1998 crash or something, I mean, it lost like 85% of its value, but right now there's something cushioning that blow. And it is because they have all these monetary assets in their reserves, not necessarily Bitcoin, although our community obviously was curious about that as well, since Putin did come out just a few weeks ago in January saying that Russia recognizes its competitive advantage with the fact that it is such an exporter of energy and so much mining happens there. So I've certainly been someone who's curious about, where they see Bitcoin in terms of potentially, an asset that they would adopt or legalize. But at the same time, authoritarian regime doesn't like something that's decentralized. So before we get into that, I just want to lean into more of the sanctions, because to me, based on everything you said, they're kind of rendered pointless, right? If they've carved out energy and they also have all of these reserves where it doesn't impact them as much as it did, what are the sanctions going to work?
So this is the thing that a lot of journalists, they're pushing a particular narrative, and I think that they're actually getting caught up in their own narrative and not taking a deeper look at what's happening. So, for example, one of the carve outs, in addition to oil and gas, the Italians, obviously want to carve out for luxury goods. The Belgians want to carve out for their diamonds that they sell to the Russian oligarchs. So these types of things are happening, but it's not being commented on because that doesn't fit the narrative that each journalist wants to push. Now, of course, if you look on the Russian side, they're not covering this at all. If you just followed Russian media, you would have no idea that they're encircling Kiev as we speak. So both sides have this issue. In terms of the specific, I think that we're going to find out. Basically, I think there's two things to watch. So the first is on Monday, we're going to find out what the price of the ruble is. And to date, I think that the market has been asleep at the wheel in terms of understanding that the ruble could massively devalue. But on Monday, now that all this information has been incorporated, we're going to find out. Over the weekend, Russian banks have been offering their customers a spread, which offers, it's like instead of a 5% spread, it's like almost like an 80% spread, 60% spread. So that's insane because what that says is the market doesn't know what's going to happen on Monday. Mm-hmm. So when the market opens on Monday, we're going to find out there. The other thing to watch out for is, can Russia set up a parallel payment system? So SWIFT is the international system that's held in Europe. But in addition to SWIFT, because of the 2014 sanctions, Russia set up their own system. And that system has started to take off a little bit. I would say it's like 15% of total payment volumes in Russia. And so in a worst case scenario, they could start shifting companies over to that system. In addition to that, it turns out China has also been planning ahead. They have their own alternative payment system to SWIFT. And I put up a Bloomberg article about it. I don't think many people are reading that type of detailed financial information, but the reality is this type of technology, it's just a messaging protocol. That's not complicated. What the key catalyst to get people to use it is you need to get people away from the US dollar. And contrary to what you or I may think, as Bitcoiners, we think the US dollar is, maybe not in a good place, but the US dollar has actually only increased market share. So I think that this, sanctions on Russia could actually serve as potentially a little bit of a push to get people away from the network effect of the US dollar, and maybe have the Chinese, trying to get people onto their system and the Russians trying to get people on their system. So you could see maybe more of a multipolar world in terms of financial infrastructure.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about how cryptocurrency is coming into play and this idea of central bank digital currencies. I saw the bank runs, the long lines you've posted, ATMs, I think running out of cash. People, I think one tweet I saw, someone was at a hotel and they were worried that Swift was going to go offline, so they needed to pay with a credit card. And they didn't know if it would work the next day. I mean, these are things that I think people can't even fathom or imagine happening here in the US. And yet we're seeing them in more places, including Canada recently, and accounts being frozen there. So, can you talk to me about just your reaction, first of all, to sort of the bank runs? And do you think that this is one of the value propositions of Bitcoin, since obviously you're an advocate of that asset?
Yeah, I think one of the ways to think about this whole situation is really that I'm not a pilot, but when you read history, there's a good analogy that a lot of pilots use, which is operational envelope, which is, for an airplane, there's like a certain environment where it works really well. And once it gets out of that environment, it starts stalling, things go wrong. Similar story for like our mental models of how the world works. My bank account is 100% accessible, except sometimes, if I've traveled internationally, I found like my phone doesn't work and I'm like totally lost. I have no idea what's going on. I can't access payment infrastructure. And I think you got to understand that a lot of our modern world is dependent on other people maintaining these like systems. And when those systems fall apart, you need to basically be able to fend for yourself. So what that means for the vast majority of people in the world is like, it makes sense to have some US dollars on the side, right? I mean, this is a modern Ukraine, Russia, these are modern countries in Europe. And if their financial infrastructure can be impacted, I think, anyone's can. Mm-hmm. And so some of these basic things that I think, over the last, call it 100 years in America, 80 years, maybe, we haven't had to deal with any kind of financial troubles at all. But if you go back and read some of the accounts of people in World War II, what were they doing? They're like obsessed with putting cash under the mattress, buying jewelry mm-hmm. and things that can be quickly pawned off. And I think the way that it plays into it now is, I think it's a fair bet to say that the internet's not going to go down. And so if the internet's not going to go down, if you have Bitcoin, you can probably liquidate that Bitcoin for the local currency. If you're in a worst case, like refugee scenario or something like that, or if you need to buy additional supplies. I think that's, it's nobody wants to view themselves as a refugee, but during the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of Americans did flee the cities to go to like rural areas or suburban areas or to more safe cities. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that if there's like another coronavirus or if, electricity goes out, you may need some cash on the side. You may want to have, your Strike wallet or additional, Bitcoin on the side to prepare for this.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see this as shining a spotlight on the features of Bitcoin that we've been trying to educate people on, the fact that you can't seize it, it's unconfiscatable, it's censorship resistant, it's really yours, and you can travel across borders with as much as you have, as opposed to, trying to collect money out of an ATM or trying to collect whatever you're stashing in your home. So I think that's really important. But I was also surprised to see the Ukrainian government even coming out and saying, hey, give us donations in cryptocurrency. We have a wallet now. Send us Tether, send us Ethereum, and of course, send Bitcoin. And one of the headlines I saw was that Ukraine has the largest treasury of Bitcoin. Can you share anything about that?
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Basically, all the government officials in Ukraine are required to report their financial holdings. If you combine them all up, then it's a very large number. So there's a lot of Bitcoin holders in the Ukrainian government positions. And, one more thing to point out there, I think a lot of times, journalists have particular narratives. And one of the narratives they have is that, they're still stuck in this world where Bitcoin is like this scary internet thing with shadowy people running it. But the reality is that Bitcoin is for democracies. So when Ukraine needed help, the Germans and the European Union and all these people that I think the journalists view as high status, turns out they left the Ukrainians out to dry. When they needed help, they put up the Bitcoin sign. It's kind of like the bat sign, and Bitcoiners sent some money. So I think that's the reality of Bitcoin. So if you want to run a democracy protest in Nigeria, put up the Bitcoin sign. If you want to free your country from Russia, put up the Bitcoin sign. I think it's a really positive, like, human message that everyone can understand. We're trapped in a city. Artillery's hitting us. It's like a World War II situation. And, we need, food to feed our people. I don't know if you saw one of the most striking images of the whole thing was people huddling in subways. It was basically like the London Blitz, come to today. I think another thing just to quickly point out is in terms of the unconfiscatability, 50% of Russia's assets are going to be confiscated, the central bank assets. And, I think they thought ahead as much as they could have. They got 50% out, but 50% is a significant amount. So like when it comes to our financial futures, like what percentage of your financial assets do you want to have subject to the whims of other people? And the reason I say that, another story that kind of hits close to home for me is, there's a lot of sick Indian medical students who are who are refugees who are trying to escape Ukraine. And basically at the border, they're checking their passports. And I guess, visually looking at them and realizing they're not Europeans and they're not letting them, into Europe. So I think a lot of people like me, I think I have a passport and, that means that I'm an equal citizen. But the reality is, it doesn't, you could be any type of person and at some point they're going to start checking your passport at the border. And if you're not the right, nationality or whatever, they're not going to let you pass, or they're going to put you in a situation you don't want to be in. And I personally, I grew up here in Michigan. There's a lot of Polish people here in Hamtramck. And there's actually a lot of people who've like families, they've escaped Europe, in the World War II time period. And there are people with those stories where they caught the last train, out of the town before the Germans came. So, real life is, I think we spend a lot of time on Netflix. We spend a lot of time, I think people are, we view America as like, it's like the 90s and things are going great. But I think the world outside of America is getting darker and darker. And Bitcoin's probably one of those like shining lights that makes things a little bit more optimistic.
I completely agree with you. I was actually surprised to see a New York Times article that said that Russia could actually use things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to subvert the sanctions. Why haven't they done that? Or what do you think? Would they do that? Would they actually adopt Bitcoin?
Yeah. So this is a very common trope from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all these like mainstream things. And I think the reason why is because they're not doing their homework. They're not running the numbers. If you look at like some of the European Union money laundering watchdogs, like they only catch 1% of money laundering. And the reason why is once someone is a significant enough criminal, they end up doing things like, some Russian oligarchs ended up buying a bank in Eastern Europe. The organized crime groups in Italy, they own significant percentages of the construction budget of the entire government of Italy. So that's widely known information. But I think that they look on things like Bitcoin because it's easy to make it dramatic. The reality is, Bitcoin is a small asset relative to the types of the size of the reserves that are being talked about here. So if Russia started buying Bitcoin, the price would go through the roof. There's not enough liquidity to absorb the kind of demand that a nation state of that size would have. So it just doesn't make any sense. I feel like they need to, pick up Google almost and just do some basic research there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because, I see Bitcoin as this nation grade technology. And potentially when you make that argument that, Russia could subvert using Bitcoin, it is actually true, but would they use it? I just don't think we're there. And I certainly don't think that the Russian government wants to adopt something that they will never be able to control. They will never be able to surveil their citizens in the same way that China rejected Bitcoin. But I can see why there's so much confusion out there, because as one of the world's largest places where the hash rate is, the world's largest mining operations are in Russia, as well as Ukraine and the US, people have been wondering why they've become a little bit more bullish on cryptocurrencies recently as far as regulation. They're not banning them like China. Putin, as I mentioned earlier, came out and said he sees the competitive advantages of Russia in the mining space. But then as I talk to people who are from Russia, they're like, absolutely not. He is not going to be for Bitcoin. He's not going to adopt Bitcoin. He probably doesn't even know what it is. And someone wrote that for him. So I was just kind of curious what your take was.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So like, again, the reality is once you're at that level, he doesn't need Bitcoin. He has the Germans, and the Germans, they have a massive, they have a horrible negotiating position because of their strong belief in green energy and hatred of science and nuclear power. So he doesn't need all this crazy stuff. He just has this dependent group of people there. But yeah, to your point, I think one of the reasons why I'm a little bit I'm not as I'm not bullish on like Russian adoption of Bitcoin is, to your point, somebody controls the Bitcoin keys, and you can imagine a situation like Venezuela where it started out like the elite were taking people's Bitcoin, and then everyone got a hold of Bitcoin. Everyone was running miners, and ended up like subverting their state a little bit. And also, if you're a Bitcoin miner, the China thing's already happened. They banned China. They kicked people out. So if you're trying to invest like more than $1 million, that's a lot of money. Like, where do you want to invest it? Somewhere like China or Russia, where they can change the laws on the whim of the leader, or somewhere like the United States, where you have strong property rights. So I don't think that's a match necessarily made in heaven. I think, I'm sure there's some people who are mining, given the low energy costs. And I think maybe one of the things to think about when you think about people like Putin and the statements that they make is, oftentimes they push forward narratives to increase social cohesion. So one of the narratives that they've been pushing when it comes to Ukraine is like, look, we've got this long history. Ukrainians are actually Russians. That's why we need to reclaim our territory before it's lost to NATO. Okay, that's one narrative. The other narrative is that they want to push things that subvert the power of the United States. So the United States, because of the strength of the dollar, is obviously very powerful. And I think that they may be using it as kind of like a rhetorical trick to undermine people's people's sense of like legitimacy, or people's sense of the future when it comes to the US dollar. I think that's the limit of that. But again, I'm not an expert in Russia or in Bitcoin mining in Russia and those types of things.
So just out of curiosity, I know everything is changing in real time and you're trying to follow it. I'm going to turn this interview around very quickly so that it's as timely as possible. But depending on where you look on social media or online, I can't even tell who's winning. I see narratives where it's like the Ukrainian military is so strong and they're shooting down all of these Russian airplanes. And then I see, especially like one of your threads, just showing the power of the Russian military and what they're doing so far. So which side is winning? I mean, can you tell? And how do you see this playing out over maybe the next week or two?
Yeah, that's a really serious question. And, I chuckled for a minute there because it's so difficult to tell. I mean, I don't think anyone can give a straight answer. The thing is, this is like a real situation where lives are at stake. So it is deadly serious. I think the way that I think about it, I'm just going to, if you don't mind, I'll just give like a little bit of strategy and tactics that'll help people interpret the information that's coming in. So the first thing is from a first principles perspective, let's look at the geography of Ukraine. The eastern side of it is like flat. It's like a steppe, right? That when you read about the Mongols, they can travel easily on the steppe in the same way Russian tanks can travel easily on flat land. The western part is hilly and marshy and forested. So it's hostile terrain. And in addition to that, there's a river that separates the country. Okay, and then it turns out layer two that there's that matches almost equally with the ethno-linguistic differences. So on the eastern side, broadly speaking, you have Russian speakers. On the western side, you have broadly speaking Ukrainian speakers. And in the past, that's determined like the way that politics works. So the western part of Ukraine, for example, was for a time a part of Poland. For a time, it was a part of Austria-Hungary. Okay, so now that being said, where have the Russians attacked? So they have strongholds in Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk. Those are the separatist republics, and those are on the eastern side of the country. So they're attacking. So basically, because since 2014, there's been a war on the eastern side of the country, some of the strongest troops are set up of the Ukrainian troops are against Luhansk and Donetsk. So they're basically bottling those troops up there. They don't want those Ukrainian troops to get out. At the same time, from the southern part of the country, there's like a lot of strategic things that the Russians need to do in terms of getting across the river and getting to Odessa, which is a major city there, as well as going to the right from the bottom from Crimea and encircling some of the strong Ukrainian soldiers that are there. At the same time, Belarus is a separate country from Russia, but it's almost like a client state at this point. And, the Russians did a lot of their staging there, and they've gone south from Belarus into the area around Kiev. I think one of the things that's difficult to understand is this is not a traditional war that we're used to seeing, where the United States rolls in overwhelming firepower, like the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This is a country like Russia, which is very strong, but it's actually small. They've only recently reformed their military, and their GDP is actually not that high. And it's competing with a near peer country, Ukraine, but Ukraine has a ton of support from the United States and others. So one of the things that you see on Twitter is a ton of these like Russian convoys that have been bombed. And you think, okay, well, I thought that the Ukrainians, or the Russians, they don't have air supremacy, but they have air superiority. So how is it possible the Ukrainians are, attacking all these convoys in this way? Well, it turns out that there are Turkish drones that are supporting the Ukrainians. And it turns out NATO is providing a ton of support to the Ukrainians, so that when the Russians had the first stage of the invasion, they were going to remove all the anti-air, guns and things like that. Turns out the Ukrainians managed to preserve a significant portion of their air force, significant portion of their anti-air batteries and stuff like that. So the thing is, all that to say, it's very complex. I think at the end of the day that the Russians will end up grinding it out over a long time period. Now, the thing that matters is how much of a resistance can the Ukrainians put up. So if they're able to keep putting up a resistance like they have, and if the European Union and the US can provide them enough support, they can end up being put in a situation where I think the best outcome would be something like a negotiated settlement, where maybe Ukraine agrees not to join NATO, Russia agrees to kind of like leave the country essentially, and you end up in a situation you were before with some caveats. So that's my hope, that the Ukrainians can not to take a side, obviously, but like I do hope that the Ukrainians can put up a good fight. But I think right now the deck is stacked in favor of a Russian victory, despite all the journalistic cheering kind of for the Ukrainians. The analog that I draw is in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war. The Armenians won the social media war because they had the support of a lot of folks. But the Azerbaijanis won the actual war physically on the ground. And my worry is that when you're not like fact checking stuff, and when you're not being a critical thinker and just echoing some of the narratives that are being put out, you could end up in a situation where you end up giving the Ukrainians a false sense of what's happening. And I think that the best thing that happened was when the Ukrainian president walked out in broad daylight with his ministers and shared that, hey, we're out in the open, told people this is a dire situation. At one point, during one of the speeches, his face was totally white and you could tell he was stressed out, but he just said like, look, there's the things we need to do to protect our country, and people stepped up. So, my hope is that, things end up well for everyone involved. And I think that this is not a war that people in either country decided to get into. It's not like a democracy, right? It's a couple of elites on each side choosing to go to war. So I hope that things turn out for the best.
Yeah, well, that's very well said, because what's so sad and tragic about anything like this is it's always the people who are innocent, who are going about their daily lives, that suffer the most. And it's been heartbreaking to see, the images of just the packed roads and people trying to escape, people now, refugees going to flee to countries like Poland. And I'm curious if those displacements are going to be permanent. Families are being separated. I saw the videos of, some of the men staying behind, saying goodbye, kissing their children. It's just really, really heartbreaking. And sorry if this is an ignorant question, but my understanding is that the US can only help to a point, or only like symbolically, right? Because Ukraine isn't in NATO, right? So at what point does this break into, we're calling it World War III on Twitter already, but at what point could it turn into World War III?
Look, I gotta say, I think that the thing that really worries me the most, like normally I don't even like talking about politics, let alone posting, these massive threads on Twitter. The thing that worries me the most is I think that there's a certain ignorance that's being displayed among some of the powerful people who are making decisions, and the people who are echoing those narratives. Because in the past, the U.S. and the USSR were very careful not to step on each other's toes and go to World War III situation.
Right.
Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, like they didn't have like everything fueled up, ready to go. It was kind of more of like a symbolic thing, and people stepped down. They made trade-offs and stuff. What I'm seeing here is I think that people have basically like, the people who are making decisions today, the advisors to the people who are making decisions, they're like several generations removed now from World War II. They're at least a generation or two removed now from like the Cuban Missile Crisis and some of the really dire situations we ended up in that time. And I suspect that they're not taking this seriously. And what I'm worried about is a situation where, like, the reality is, even if you don't like him, or if you like him, whatever, Putin is the head of Russia, which is a country which has 6,000 nukes. It has more nuclear weapons than the United States. So I don't care, if you have a strong belief in democracy or whatever else, nothing can justify potentially putting the entire world at risk to make like a political point. So I think that there needs to be like a way out essentially for Putin, because the way that everyone is signaling now, it seems like they just really want to go to war. And I don't understand it, frankly. In fact, I've seen American, I think government officials almost, who've basically said that the Ukrainians shouldn't negotiate with the Russians. And I think that the best thing would be if, we don't go to war, and we just negotiate a settlement that works for everyone, and Ukrainians can, start developing their country again. But the thing that worries me is like there's no walking back. I think people are like really politically motivated to make things happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely concerning too, because that word, the nuclear threats are coming up today, right? And Putin basically, everyone's on high alert for that. But I mean, we're not going to destroy the world, right? We're not, I mean, we have so much power when it comes to nuclear weapons that would be, it would be over, right, for everybody. So no one wants to touch that button because we're too advanced now, right? So I mean, I just don't see how this ends.
Yeah, I think so. To your, like, here's the piece of information which I guess is not like widely being distributed as we speak, or I guess as we speak. Belarus, which is the country that aided Russia, they're having a referendum. It's not a democratic country, so the outcome's already known, that they're going to allow the country to have nukes again. And then they're going to ask Russia to put their nuclear weapons that they sent back because of the Soviet Union back to their country. So now Russia is going to have nuclear weapons that much closer to Europe. And the reality is, over the last 20 years, the Russians have seen that from the other side, where they feel like they're being encircled. And I guess I have to ask, I live in Detroit. My roads are not very good. When I drive into the downtown, like, the factories are bombed out because they haven't been used in 50 years. This place used to be the arsenal of democracy. My granduncle came to this country. He walked into Ford like with a resume, got a job. A couple of years later, was an executive. And it's like, those opportunities don't exist for young people today. Right. So I personally don't understand why, like, we need to defend every single inch of Europe, or why, like, NATO needs to push eastwards at all costs. So I personally am worried as well. Like, you said something interesting, which is people are more advanced. I would have to argue against that a little bit. I don't think people are more advanced. I think people are very tribal. I'm definitely seeing it on Twitter. I did a fact check and somebody lashed out at me like, are you like, you like hate the Ukrainians or something? And it's like, dude, I'm fact checking the Russians as well. They have their own fake news that's happening, but people are like picking sides in this conflict as if it's a sports team.
Right.
And this is not like it's a sports team and then we all celebrate later. This is like real life. The most shocking video for me was there was like, I think it was like a Russian jet shooting a missile. Might have been a misfire, might have been coming from behind it. But there's a mom who's recording it. And as the thing makes impact, it makes like a loud noise and the child starts crying. And it's like, it just really brought it home for me. Like, wow, like all this stuff is just talk, but the reality on the ground is very serious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's horrible to watch. And I'm, like I said, I mean, I'm really worried about how this is going to unfold, because I just don't see it. I don't see how this ends in a way that doesn't have so many lives at stake, and I think that we've never seen a war like this play out on social media with everybody just reacting and making it political, which is really scary and sad. Before we start to wrap up, I just wanted to quickly dig into a little bit of what you mentioned about Germany and its reliance on natural gas from Europe and how that's affecting everything economically. One of the sanctions was basically to stop the Nord Stream 2 project, right? Which is this it's infrastructure that goes under the Baltic Sea and allows for the transfer of natural gas from Russia directly to Germany. Can you break that down for people that are just really unfamiliar of just the reliance and why Germany maybe was like a little bit wary about removing Russia from SWIFT and halting some of their business? Obviously, though, the energy was carved out, like you mentioned, but can you just lay the land of how dependent Germany and other countries are on Russia?
Yeah. So before I start, I say bad things about the green energy people. That's because I am one. So in my past life, I worked for GE Capital. We financed the most wind farms in America. Financed a ton of solar energy farms. So I mean, I've like the reason I talk about it so passionately is because I was in the industry and I just care a lot. So the way to think about it is, you can't think about energy the way that we talk about it in America, which is like, rah, the solar panel prices are declining. The reality is you got to think about it like an engineer. And the way that a power grid works is, there's certain types of energy which have what's called high base load, which means they just run all the time. So there's some bad things like coal. There's also some good things like nuclear energy. So nuclear energy has zero carbon emissions. There's also some things that are really cheap to turn on and off again. And they're pretty cheap in America, which is natural gas. So if you ever need a ton of energy all at once, you turn on some natural gas engines. There's also some stuff which is unreliable. So wind and solar. So obviously when the wind's not blowing, you can't use wind energy. And when the sun's not shining, you can't use the sun. Also, people talk a lot about batteries. Tesla's always in the news. Battery technology is very poor. You can't use batteries. That's the facts. The other thing is that you can't transport. So sometimes the wind blows in areas that's different from where people live. Whenever you transport energy across power lines, it loses some of the power along the way. So you can't just put power lines everywhere. Some places like California and Germany have incentivized the use of renewable energy. France has as well. Anytime they do this, what ends up happening is they shut down coal power plants, which provide a steady amount of energy. And then they turn on the solar power and the wind power, which gives you a ton of energy at some times, but not a lot of energy at other times. And it's not actually reliable. And so if they're shutting down the coal plants, or sometimes they don't, but in order to fill the gaps between when it's not reliable, they end up using, like in Germany at one point, they were like burning wood. They get coal and they put the coal in order to like fill the gaps. And one of the things to understand is people don't like nuclear energy because, this is well documented. You sound like a conspiracy theorist when you talk about it, but the Russian energy companies did finance the green movement in Europe. And so they gave like I think the number is roughly $90+ million in the last couple of years to the green energy folks to finance like the promotion of green energy and the demonization of nuclear energy. And the reason for that is, of course, they want to continue selling oil and gas there. A similar story in the United States where like the oil and gas companies demonize nuclear energy. The reason those two groups have like a connection is the more green energy you use, the more coal you're going to use, the more natural gas you're going to use. So the Koch brothers are the biggest financiers of the green movement. And it's concerning for people who care about science and who care about like cheap nuclear energy. So one of the things too is people say nuclear energy is not safe. The reality is nuclear energy is very safe. And they also say it's too expensive, but when you build more of it, what ends up happening is the cost goes down. You maintain the same safety. So they've banned us from building it in the United States. So like we wouldn't know, but the science is there for those who are curious to learn more. As it relates back to the Germans, that's the situation that they've massively reduced their negotiating position. They can't walk away easily at this point because their whole all of their young people and all their politicians are like completely motivated by the use of green energy. It's like the motivating thing that keeps their society coherent. And so, as a result, we're seeing the Ukrainians being instrumentalized in a very negative way.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting to see the energy portion of this whole conflict. And Germany shut down its nuclear power plants, and that's for another episode entirely. Just the fact that Bitcoiners are one of the communities that have been shining the spotlight, saying, yes, okay, the media might point to Fukushima and Chernobyl, but those are such outliers, and nuclear power should really be harnessed, because if we do want clean energy and we want something that's, scalable, we need to look to other places. And it's sad the misinformation that's out there on that as well.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with there's like an HBO show called Chernobyl, and it goes like in depth, and it really scares people about the situation. Well, like one of the realities, and that's what they tell you. But then the reality is, like, more people died in the evacuation around Fukushima than died from nuclear energy exposure or radiation exposure. So more people died from the scare of nuclear energy than died from the actual radiation. And similar story in America. When you don't have nuclear energy, you have coal plants, and they spit out pollution, and so people are dying from pollution. And it's just unnecessary stuff.
Right. Yeah. And it's crazy to think, Chernobyl, I think the Russian forces, right, took over the Chernobyl area. Let's just wrap this around, I guess, and start to close this out. What should people know right now? Again, I know things are changing in real time. You're going to be watching it, but heading into the start of this week, what are you going to be watching for? What should people know?
So I think the first thing you got to watch out for is what's going to be the price of the ruble in US dollars on Monday when trading opens. Early indications seem like it's going to be, massively devalued. That's going to impact the ability of the Russian state to continue waging war. Now, I think short term, anytime a government wages war, the elites who are running it get more powerful. So I don't think it's going to have the impact that some of these journalists are saying, but I think it's an important indicator. The other thing to watch out for is how long can the Ukrainians hold out in some of these key cities like Kiev and Kharkiv. I think some of the things that are being stated, like Germany is rearming or they're sending a ton of munitions, I would take some of that with a grain of salt. But at the same time, I think that how much commitment financially and in terms of arms the Western allies are willing to send to Ukraine is going to be one of the deciding factors in how long they can hold out. So I would just seriously take it. It's hard to say where to look, but I think just, keep an eye on what happens in Kiev, keep an eye on what happens in Kharkiv, and, see what happens in terms of like any type of support from third-party countries.
Yeah. And don't trust verify, because there's going to be a lot of crazy stuff happening, I'm sure, all week. Any final thoughts? Anything else that we didn't go over that you just want to touch on?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the key things to touch on here is it's a very uncertain world. And in the same way that, the US dollar financial system is, ruled for a very long time. And then all of a sudden we're in this uncertainty where it's not clear where it's going to go. And things like Bitcoin are stepping into the void. I think that it seems like the real world is seeing something similar. So in the past, you had 3 TV channels. Now you've got 1 million Twitter accounts. And I think that people, should understand that that's happening, and that's happening in terms of countries as well. And like, you got to prepare for it. And I think the way to prepare for it is in the same way that we're strategically disconnecting from the financial system, buying Bitcoin and kind of building our own strength. I think that there's an argument to do the same thing in other aspects of your life. So instead of, watching, Fox News or CNN, read a book and try to check the facts as they come in. So I think the analogy goes, a lot of different ways. And I hope that people, don't just get caught up in the financial aspect of Bitcoin, but also think about how some of these cypherpunk ideas can have implications in other parts of their lives. Like, hey, make sure you understand, what kind of media you're consuming. Make sure, you think about, how you're involved politically, and, are you, writing letters to your congressperson about making sure there's like a Bitcoin ETF and stuff like that.
Normally I ask this question at the beginning, but just out of curiosity, how did you get into Bitcoin, and why do you have such conviction for it?
Yeah, I got into Bitcoin. I heard about Bitcoin from a college professor. I looked it up. It said people with drugs are using it, and there's like a set of developers. So I just assumed, they're going to get taken out. It's not a serious thing. And but then later on, when I came upon it, I actually first started looking at things like Ethereum, and I looked at Bitcoin a little bit. But actually, what really convinced me was the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute. It's like a website online where they post interesting cypherpunk papers from the past. And one of the things that I read was actually Nick Szabo's series of essays, like Shelling Out and some of the others, and understanding some of those cypherpunk principles, like really helped give me a good pattern matching mechanism for thinking about the world. And so like when I heard about the Russian assets being seized, the first thing I thought was like, yeah, dude, not your keys, not your Bitcoin. And so like, trusted third parties is a great concept that people should look into. That's a great Nick Szabo essay. So basically, I kind of felt like this was really interesting and it felt like the right thing, but I'm not sure if it makes sense like from a money perspective. But I ended up becoming a hodler, just a little bit out of conviction that it felt like these are the right ideas. Turns out it was the right decision, like financially as well. I think Bitcoin's performed really strongly over the last couple of years. And in terms of what gives me conviction, I mean, I think that when you run the numbers and when you follow like how deep the rabbit hole, I guess to use that cliche, it just seems like things are going to work out.
I love that. That's a great place to end it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.